Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we've got something really special in front of us. I have a stack here of these really dense, brightly colored archival magazines. They're all published between 1952 and 1960. And these aren't just, historical documents. They are the official story, the state-mandated narratives from that time, and they're detailing these massive infrastructural projects, the whole post-war reconstruction effort, and some really profound social shifts.
And for you listening, we need to be very clear about our mission here. We are not interested in recounting history for its own sake. There's no nostalgia today.
Right.
Our approach is, well, it's structural. It's almost surgical. We're treating this 9-year window, 1952 to 1960, as what we're calling the Zero Kilometer.
The Zero Kilometer. I like that. The starting point of the highway we're still on.
Exactly. This was that immediate post-war and crucially post-Stalin period where the core systemic decisions, the foundational fears, the entire economic architecture was all encoded into the system. Our task is to trace that precise line of inertia.
So we're identifying the initial choices we find in these pages.
And showing how they continue to dictate the institutional structures, the economic assumptions, and even the fundamental psychological expectations of your life in 2026. Every single piece of archival information we dissect today has to be immediately tied to a contemporary, observable, systemic consequence.
That's a perfect brief. It's an operational manual, not a history book.
Yeah.
So let's start with what feels like the loudest, most overwhelming signal coming from these sources, especially the early ones from 52 through 54.
Yeah.
And that is this almost intoxicating focus on scale. Just sheer overwhelming scale and a kind of cult of acceleration.
It's the sheer force of the rebound. That's the first thing you feel. The narrative isn't one of, measured, careful recovery. It is one of immediate, large-scale, and monumental mastery.
We see this reflected right away in the reconstruction of cities. I'm looking at photos here, places like Oryol, Kharkov, Minsk. Cities that suffered just catastrophic destruction.
Total devastation.
And they're shown being restored at this incredible speed. But crucially, they weren't just rebuilt. They were rebuilt grandly. They're using this heavy, classical, almost imperial architectural style.
Right. It's designed to signal permanence, unwavering power.
So the speed and that stylistic monumentality, that was a statement in and of itself.
Absolutely. The reconstruction wasn't just about providing housing. It was proving that the state had the capacity to instantaneously deploy massive resources. But the real structural encoding, the thing that really set the pattern, came from the megastructures. The project's designed to master nature and generate power.
And the sources are just saturated with them. It's all about the new hydropower plants, the HPPs. I'm seeing Kakhovka, Zaporozhye, Stalingrad over and over again.
The emphasis in the press is never on, say, regional energy needs or the local ecology. It's never about the small picture. It is always about the physical side.
The scale of the excavation.
The unprecedented speed of completion. It's all about breaking records.
Okay, so let's take one of those as a case study. The Kakhovka Dam is highlighted here in a 1954 source.
Yes. And the language they use to describe its construction is, well, it's startlingly definitive. It is described, and this is a direct quote from the mindset, as being built to last an unlimited time.
Unlimited time.
That single phrase, that's the foundation of the inertia we're talking about today. It's a declaration. It says that this structure, and by extension, the state's decision to build it, transcends all normal measures of depreciation, of cost-benefit analysis, or even of political lifespan.
Its colossal presence is its own justification.
Its presence validates its necessity.
I have to push back on that just a little bit, though. In the immediate post-war environment, wasn't immense state-directed infrastructure necessary? You had to industrialize. You had to house the population. How do we differentiate between what was arguably a necessary post-war centralization and the kind of structural inertia that then persists long after that necessity is gone?
And that is the absolute core distinction. The difference is in the mechanism of validation. The structure that was launched in the 1950s was this deep, baked-in structural preference for scale over granularity.
Scale over granularity.
The narrative back then, we can call it narrative A, was rapid, state-led mastery of nature and restoration as a moral and economic imperative. So the speed and the sheer size of the physical output, like a dam or a factory, they became the only primary measures of success.
And that success was intrinsically linked to political viability.
Completely. The moral imperative of rebuilding the country justified the massive scale, which in turn justified the centralized control required to achieve that scale. It's a self-reinforcing loop.
So the system learned a simple lesson. If you can move a mountain, you are successful, even if you move the wrong mountain.
Even if you move the wrong mountain. And what about granularity? What did that obsession with scale prevent them from seeing?
Well, granularity in this context would be things like local resource management, decentralized planning.
Regional needs assessments, long-term quality control. By prioritizing the monumental, you necessarily have to ignore the detailed, the regional, the human scale requirements. The mechanism they launched validated the idea that scale itself is proof of political and technological viability.
Okay, so let's make that direct connection. Fast forward to today, 2026. What does that translated systemic norm look like in our lives?
Today, it functions as the normalization of infrastructure megaprojects as the primary driver of economic validation and national identity. That same impulse persists in modern state investments, particularly in technology and physical infrastructure.
So you mean things like massive, nationally championed digital network rollouts?
Yeah.
Or these gigantic new industrial parks?
Or any high-profile physical project that seems to suffer from a chronically poor localized return on investment. Think about it. The validation for these projects today, where does it come from? It still comes primarily from their size, from the accompanying national pride and the geopolitical statement they make.
And all of that often overshadows any real concerns about local needs, or the quality of the long-term execution, or just basic operational inefficiency.
The ghost of the Kukka Dam's unlimited time mandate is still there. It continues to fund projects whose true utility might be questionable, but whose symbolic value is immense.
And this structural bias, it didn't just apply to dams and cities. We're seeing it applied to agriculture, which is, by its very nature, granular and biological. The sources from 54 and 55 are full of the Salina, the Virgin Lands campaign.
The Virgin Lands campaign is a textbook example of this structural logic being misapplied. The state had a food problem, a serious one, and instead of trying to solve it through careful, regionally tailored agricultural science, improving yields where farming already existed, they opted for a solution driven by monumental scale.
They aimed to cultivate 13 million hectares of new land.
It was a physical conquest. They deployed vast resources, thousands of people, mechanized combine harvesters. The message was clear. We can conquer even poor soil if we just apply enough centralized force.
And what was the long-term cost of that conquest?
The cost was massive. It led to incredible environmental strain, severe soil degradation, and ultimately highly unstable yields that were completely dependent on erratic weather patterns. It wasn't sustainable. But the systemic consequence that persists today is that major state investment still defaults to these large, geographically expansive, high-visibility solutions.
Right.
The centralized planning structure, which was reinforced in the 1950s, it perpetuates this belief that complex, systemic problems are best solved by just maximizing the resource impact.
A belief that just fundamentally ignores the complex, decentralized nature of, say, biological and ecological systems.
Absolutely. The psychological comfort that you get from the size of the political effort outweighs the practical reality of the long-term unstable economic or environmental yield.
So we've identified the underlying structural law. Scale equals competence. Now let's audit the entities, the institutions that were driving this system, and see if their DNA is still recognizable in the institutions of 2026.
We can clearly identify three institutional actors dominating the 1950s narrative, and they're all working in very tight coordination.
Okay, so the first one, providing the philosophical and the financial fuel, has to be the state party apparatus. They're the source of the macro 5-year plans, the moral narrative. You see them through figures like Malenkov in his 1953 budget reports or Khrushchev's foreign policy moves. They set the big quantitative goals.
And second, you have the implementers, the engineers, the metallurgists, the technicians. We can group them as heavy industry and engineering. They were the ones who had to make the plan a physical reality.
And they're celebrated in these magazines. I'm seeing pictures of specialists designing Lithuanian turbines, workers at the Zaporizhzhia metallurgical plant.
Teams developing early calculating machines and high-voltage laboratories. Their entire function was to translate political will into physical output. Kilowatts, tons of steel, square meters of housing.
And then the third actor is the media and propaganda machine itself, specifically journals like the ones we're analyzing. Their job was to act as a structural reflector, a mirror that validates the plan through highly selective reporting. They provided the necessary international context. There's a chart here from 1959 explicitly comparing their 68.6 million tons of wheat production against the U.S.'s 30.7 million. It's just a pure quantitative statement of supremacy.
And the stimuli driving these three institutions, they were explicitly quantitative. It was all about technological priority, but a very specific kind of priority designed for scaling up. Success was purely an output measure.
We have these specific, almost manic metrics everywhere. Achieving 53 million tons of steel in 1959, the constant drive to increase oil production, and even these micro-level campaigns.
Yes, like the one at the Moscow automobile plant. It's a headline achievement that they saved 714 tons of metal.
That metal-saving anecdote is genuinely fascinating because of how granular the planning went. I mean, they didn't just say we saved metal. They calculated that 714 tons of saved metal enabled the production of exactly 5,000 trucks, 20,000 refrigerators, and 7,600 bicycles.
It's the plan personified. It presents this hyper-rationalization as a moral triumph. Every scrap of metal has a purpose determined by the center.
It's a story of efficiency.
It is. And the second major stimulus, as you mentioned, was technological priority. But again, it was specifically geared toward mass output and centralized control. The focus was never on user flexibility or consumer choice. It was on mechanizing agriculture with combines, constructing the automated bread factory, and investing in advanced research.
Okay, speaking of advanced research, the outline mentions a proposal for anti-gravity technology in a 1960 issue. That detail seems almost, well, out of place next to bread factories and steel mills.
Yeah.
What did that actually look like? Was it presented as serious engineering or just speculative fantasy?
What's fascinating is how the narrative incorporated it. It wasn't presented as some whimsical fantasy. It was presented as a serious, albeit futuristic, component of the relentless technological pursuit that the plan required.
So it was part of the bigger picture of inevitable progress.
Exactly. The inclusion of topics like anti-gravity, even if it was totally unproven, it demonstrates the sheer breadth of technological ambition the system needed to project. The message was crystal clear. There are no technological limits we cannot eventually overcome if the plan dictates it.
Which reinforces the idea that technology was a tool of state ambition first and foremost. It wasn't about generating profit or serving immediate consumer needs.
Precisely. It was about proving the system's inherent superiority through technological conquests.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It speaks volumes about that technology for the plan mentality. Now, let's connect that specific rhetoric, the impulse to save 714 tons of metal or to build an anti-gravity device. How does that manifest in modern corporate and state justifications in 2026?
The structural repetition today is very clear. It lies in the rhetoric that justifies speed and scale through geopolitical necessity. Look at the 1960 source on foreign policy. Aid to nations like India, Iraq, and Egypt is framed as cooperative development, a gesture of peace.
But there's an undertone.
There's a very explicit justification. It's all happening within the context of competition against imperialist power. The geopolitical threat provides the necessary structural justification for centralized resource control and for these massive investments.
So the ideology can change. We move from anti-imperialism to, say, the global digital competition, but the underlying rhetorical structure stays exactly the same.
Yes. The state says, we must execute this massive centralized project or we will fall behind our rivals. It's an existential threat.
And today, the institutional actors, whether they are powerful state-linked corporations or nationally designated tech champions or even academic institutions getting massive government grants, they use the same playbook.
They utilize the exact same rhetoric of existential competition. You hear phrases like the global tech race, the national security imperative, or winning the quantum future. These are the modern-day equivalents of the 1950s output quotas.
They're terms that are deployed to justify large, often single-source, state-directed investments in fields like advanced AI, cyber infrastructure, or defense modernization.
Which means the incentive remains locked in the quantitative. We're still seeking the validation of quantitative superiority, often regardless of genuine qualitative development.
Whether it was 53 million tons of steel back then, or achieving a certain metric of AI computing power now, the argument is the same. This massive state investment is necessary to maintain geopolitical status.
And that insulates the project from scrutiny. You can't question it based on localized needs or consumer feedback because it's a matter of national survival. The system established in the 1950s made state-directed heavy lifting sound like the only option, and that structure of justification is incredibly durable.
So it perpetuates the cycle. Speed and output metrics get prioritized, which often results in these expensive end products that lack genuine competition or just fail to address the actual granular demands of the population.
The institution is validated by the sheer size of its effort, not by the quality of its outcome.
Let's move to a concept that should, frankly, worry anyone interested in systemic change. It's the decisions made under pressure, things framed as temporary adjustments or emergency relief.
That somehow became permanent, immovable, structural fixtures of life for 70 years.
Right. This highlights how crisis management can become the default operating system.
And this phenomenon is most obvious during the systemic shock of the 1953-1954 period, right after the death of Stalin. The government made these rapid economic shifts designed to stabilize the volatile agricultural sector and, frankly, boost the morale of the populace.
Okay, let's focus on agriculture first. The 1954 source details this really clearly. The measure. The state announced a significant increase in the procurement prices for key agricultural products.
Meat, milk, potatoes, vegetables.
And at the same time, they reduced agricultural taxes. This was explicitly framed as a rapid, necessary step to stimulate production and provide immediate, vital relief to collective farmers after years of strain. It was crisis intervention.
It was an emergency measure. But the systemic inertia is that this emergency relief established a new baseline. It created the permanent structural expectation of subsidized costs and managed agricultural prices.
So the state intervention, which was designed to just rapidly correct a farm income deficit,
it became institutionalized. It morphed into this permanent, highly complex, and incredibly expensive system of subsidies, quotas, and non-market price controls.
so the system basically became addicted to the fix. It never returned to market-based signals.
Precisely. And in 2026, this system is a profound liability. It requires continuous, vast public funding, often hidden through these opaque mechanisms. The core problem is that the government is locked into that 1950s security pact. They have to guarantee stable farm incomes and maintain low, stable costs for basic foodstuffs.
And the real underlying cost of producing food, from fuel to fertilizer to labor, it becomes functionally invisible to the urban household.
That's it. The short-term crisis response became a high, long-term governmental responsibility that is politically and economically terrifying to dismantle today.
And we see a clear parallel in how the post-war housing crisis was addressed. So the measure, an intense, monumental focus on mass housing construction. Millions of square meters were being restored and newly built.
Right, and the 1953 sources also mentioned that this was supplemented by individual construction credits. The State Construction Bank would give out loans for small private houses, even for cowsheds on private plots.
It was a dual approach then, mass state housing and some limited individual credit.
And it was intended to solve the immediate shortage. However, the mass state construction very quickly became the dominant, enduring norm, state-driven, mass-produced housing. After Stalin's death, the architectural philosophy shifted aggressively away from that ornate classical grandiosity
To what we now call industrialized construction, prioritizing volume, standardization, and speed above absolutely everything else.
The functional became the aesthetic. They had to build fast. And that necessity redefined what housing was.
And while this did provide shelter and met the immediate crisis volume requirements,
The state retained almost total centralized control over land allocation, urban planning, material standards. Standardization became the absolute rule.
so what's the systemic consequence for us in 2026?
The legacy is immense, and it's twofold. First, we have these vast stocks of standardized, often architecturally low-quality legacy housing. The mass blocks built quickly in that era, and they now represent immense, often ignored, long-term maintenance and renovation liabilities.
These buildings age poorly and their maintenance costs just spiral.
They do. And second, this model deeply entrenched our reliance on state-backed mortgages and centralized urban planning agencies. This institutionalization fundamentally restricts diversified private market development. It prevents our urban centers from evolving flexibly in response to bottom-up needs.
So the 1950s emergency housing program, just by its massive scale, it functionally defined the architectural, logistical, and financial parameters of urban life for nearly 3/4 of a century.
The state became the indispensable, the default, and often the inefficient developer.
Okay, so we've tracked the inertia from this abstract idea of scale down to institutional norms. Now we have to trace it all the way down to the final layer, the household. How does a decision made in 1953 by a central planner about steel production or meat prices actually influence the structure of an ordinary person's life today?
Let's start with income and prices. The 1950s established a really profound psychological and economic expectation. We have foreign observers traveling through the country in 1953 and 1960, and they consistently remarked on the perceived high wages and low taxes.
And the massive system of social consumption funds.
Exactly. The funds that paid for comprehensive health care, pensions, and housing. Even the price of the magazine we're analyzing, a low 6 rubles, was itself a visible marker of these fixed, controlled costs for essentials.
That's the input then. A social pact where essential services are decoupled from their true economic cost and are instead funded by the collective.
And the 2026 household budget is structurally determined by this inheritance. It's the historical expectation that utilities and essential services, housing, energy, basic food, should remain arbitrarily low.
And this expectation is emotional and structural, not necessarily logical.
That's a great way to put it. The 1950s created a security pact. You contribute to the collective project, and in return, we guarantee that the floor of basic necessity is low and stable. To sustain this, the state must still run vast, opaque, cross-subsidization programs today.
So if the state is subsidizing the cost of electricity generated by a 60-year-old HPP or the cost of centralized heating from a plant built in that era, that means the true price of those essentials is being deliberately obscured from the consumer.
And that obscuring mechanism creates a major structural price distortion that defines modern consumption. You end up with these relatively lower costs for necessities, a cheap bus ticket, a subsidized rent. But this often requires lower overall net wages because the social costs are managed collectively and, crucially, invisibly.
Furthermore, items that were not covered by that 1950s security pack, high-quality consumer goods, imported electronics, advanced cars, they remain relatively more expensive. They lack that historical subsidy structure.
Right. And this locks households into a consumption hierarchy that was established in the mid-century. It prioritizes collective provisioning over individual consumer choice.
So the system makes a cheap loaf of bread possible, but it makes a cutting-edge smartphone feel like a luxury that's only accessible through debt or gray markets. It mirrors that 1950s dichotomy between necessities and high-tech imports.
Moving on to security and freedoms, the magazines heavily emphasized comprehensive state-mandated welfare, free medical care, universal education, and these extensive organized rest and leisure facilities.
Sanatorias, pioneer camps. I'm seeing a note here, 350 pioneer camps in 1960. State-run tourism. This was the delivery of security via the state's own apparatus.
And the trade-off that was established back then was security in exchange for comprehensive social services. The cost of that trade-off today is the deep acceptance of the paternalistic state management of welfare tied to employment status or residency.
So the security provided by the state institutionalized these specific mechanisms of control over your personal life, particularly mobility and social access.
Yes. Leisure, for example, was highly channeled. Domestic tourism and state-run sanatoria were prioritized, which implicitly limited spontaneous or independent travel options. Education was tracked and centrally planned.
And what about the communication networks? The 1953 source mentions the rapid expansion of the postal, telegraph, and radio networks.
That rapidly expanding infrastructure established a critical duality. It was certainly presented as a service to the populace, enhancing connection, of course. However, it was fundamentally a central managed network. Its structure served the interests and coordination needs of the state first and foremost.
And this normalized state control over the fundamental channels of information and personal interaction.
It did. In 2026, we just accept that critical infrastructure, even digital infrastructure, serves the state's security interests as much as, or sometimes more than, the individual's freedom. The individual's welfare and security became highly centralized and dependent on continued institutional linkage.
Okay, let's talk about the mental inheritance, the psychology. These archives deliver a constant visual and narrative barrage of monumental effort. Giant excavators, success reports from enormous collective farms, and this political spectacle, like the New Year's Ball for Youth held in the Grand Kremlin Palace in 1954.
The entire atmosphere was perpetually focused on overcoming an immense struggle. The trauma of the war, the challenge of mastering nature, the threat of external rivals, it's a narrative of constant overcoming.
And this relentless narrative, it solidified what we call the routine of monumentalism.
The 2026 manifestation of that is the normalization of systemic anxiety regarding external status and the psychological prioritization of scale. Households unconsciously absorb this idea that genuine success is measured by vast, often abstract national achievements,
Military power, space exploration, the latest massive digital project.
rather than by granular, localized improvements in the quality of daily life, things like functional public services or just domestic tranquility.
It creates kind of structural cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Your personal manageable struggles become secondary to the success of the overarching collective project.
The anxiety about maintaining global status, the need to constantly prove scale, that became the default psychological routine. This is why the focus on firsts and biggest is so persistent.
Right?
The psychological validation for the population comes from these outward, globally comparative metrics of power, which makes the populace psychologically prone to accepting lower quality, higher systemic risk, or continued personal austerity internally, as long as the state successfully maintains the veneer of external technological or military dominance.
The scale of the Kakovka HPP wasn't just about electricity.
It was about psychological assurance that the collective capacity was limitless.
Okay, so if the system of the 1950s created this architecture of success, it also, by necessity, created zones of non-reporting, systemic blind spots. What did this structural imperative, fueled by the needs of censorship and central planning, prevent these magazines from seeing or even acknowledging?
The most glaring absence from the narrative of success is the environmental cost. It's just not there. The sources celebrate the mastery of nature. We see reports on the main Turkmen Canal, huge irrigation efforts, and these agricultural projects like the Latvian drainage of 157,000 hectares to increase arable land.
And these were all reported as pure, unambiguous gains. More water, more crops, the line only goes up.
But the progress narrative, by its very design, could not include the long-term ecological impacts. The system had no structural mechanism or incentive to publish or analyze the long-term consequences.
Things like resource depletion, the salinization of newly irrigated lands.
Or the inevitable displacement of local biospheres caused by giant HPPs or canals. The only metric that mattered was the increase in cultivated area or power generation capacity within the current 5-year window. The environmental cost was structurally externalized.
And thus rendered invisible in the official report.
Exactly. We know now, from history, the disastrous consequences of this approach in some regions, but the planning apparatus could not publish that friction.
Another crucial blind spot relates to the true cost of efficiency. We discussed the intense emphasis on rationalization, like that metal savings campaign.
That intense drive for rationalization prioritized immediate production output and the fulfillment of the plan quota above everything else. And this often meant sacrificing long-term material quality, essential safety redundancy, and, crucially, the environmental disposal of industrial byproducts.
The celebrated growth in oil production in Baku, for instance, which is mentioned in the 1953 sources.
It was celebrated purely for its output volume. The subsequent costs, industrial waste management, site remediation, long-term public health impacts were systemically ignored because they detracted from the core metric of speed and output.
The system demanded speed, and long-term quality control was a structural luxury it just could not afford to report on.
And finally, there's the internal friction, the failures within the centralized machine itself.
Which the magazines were structurally prevented from analyzing.
Yes, the intersystemic failures. The narrative had to be one of seamless, flawless execution of the plan. You could never publish an article detailing the localized waste caused, because a major tractor plant produced a huge surplus of engines but failed to produce enough chassis due to a supply chain bottleneck.
Or detailing that the new calculating machine from 1953, which was celebrated as this great advance, was practically unusable due to unreliable components or a lack of trained maintenance staff.
Any friction between the planned components was structurally unreportable. To report it would be to imply a failure of centralized omniscience and competence.
So if the 1950s system suffered from this blindness regarding environmental accountability, long-term quality, and internal plan friction, where is the analogous blind spot today in 2026?
The analogous blind spot exists today in the unquestioned pursuit of rapid technological scaling and digital optimization. We are fundamentally repeating the mid-century error. We've simply shifted the domain from heavy industry to digital systems.
Today's system celebrates efficiency and technological advancement, mass AI deployment, digital governance integration, national data networks in the same unquestioning monumental way it celebrated the construction of the Kakovka HPP in 1954.
We prioritize the narrative of speed. The future is now imperative.
And in doing so, we systematically ignore the long-term societal and psychological costs of this rapid scale.
We do. This includes the inherent fragility of complex digital dependencies, which is the modern equivalent of a major HPT failure, where systemic stability rests on single central points. It includes massive data security vulnerabilities that come with centralized networks, and of course, the rapid, unchecked erosion of low-tech human labor markets.
So the modern system, just like the 1950s one, prioritizes the visible speed and scale of the future narrative over creating robust, decentralized, and human-scale alternatives.
Alternatives that prioritize resiliency and quality of life. The industrial monolith has been replaced by the digital monolith, but the blindness to externalized costs remains the same structural feature.
Okay, the inertia from the 1950s is remarkably rigid. Based on this historical foundation, what are the two main vectors for how this system resolves itself going forward? The central tension, as you described it, is between the necessity of centralized control and the simultaneous promise of decentralized consumer abundance.
That tension must eventually break. It can't hold forever. And that leads to two divergent scenarios. The system cannot indefinitely sustain the low-cost expectations established in the 1950s while simultaneously participating in a globalized modern economy.
Okay, let's explore scenario one, fading, or what you call market rationalization.
The logic here is just pure economic strain. The systemic liabilities created by that 1950s social pact, the permanently subsidized basic consumer prices, the managed farm costs, the guaranteed low-cost housing and utilities, they become economically too heavy to carry.
The state, simply put, runs out of money to indefinitely sustain the 70-year-old promise.
Exactly. So the projection is that the state must retreat from its role as the total guarantor of low basic costs. This would trigger a painful shift away from that post-war economic security pact.
Services that were structurally designated as socialized rights, like the low-cost utilities powered by those aging HPPs, the centralized heating networks, the subsidized food chain would be
Gradually, perhaps reluctantly, exposed to market dynamics. This shift represents the slow, painful undoing of the zero-kilometer economic expectations.
So what's the concrete marker we should look for? How would we know the scenario is genuinely unfolding?
The clearest marker would be the privatization and subsequent massive price volatility rate hikes of major utility networks. Electricity, centralized heating, water, all the things that were structurally created and socialized during the 1950s reconstruction.
And when the price of basic electricity or hot water starts following true market logic.
The backlash will be immense. The population won't be reacting to a new policy. They will be resisting the loss of a foundational, 7-decade-old structural expectation of economic security.
Now let's look at the opposing and perhaps more frightening vector. Scenario 2. Radicalization or total optimization.
This scenario assumes that the 1950s planning mentality, that relentless impulse to maximize output, eliminate waste, and achieve total resource control doesn't fade. Instead, it is technologically empowered and perfected by 2026 capabilities like AI and big data analytics.
So the impulse to save 714 tons of metal, but applied universally and instantly using algorithms.
Precisely. The projection here is that the historical impulse for centralized efficiency is applied to every single facet of society, creating a fully automated, predictive, and micromanaged economic structure.
A structure designed to eliminate all perceived waste and irrationality.
Whether that's overproduction in a factory, non-optimal consumption in a city, or even unplanned leisure that subtracts from productive national time, it is the logical, technological completion of the original centralized plan.
If the fading scenario is signaled by massive rate hikes, what's the clear indicator of this radicalization scenario?
The definitive marker would be mandatory national digital monitoring of individual consumption patterns and production cycles, extending from major state factories right down to the household level.
Wow.
This continuous real-time data flow would be used by sophisticated central planning algorithms to constantly optimize resource allocation and eliminate waste. The system would know not just what you bought, but when and why, and it would use that data to pre-allocate resources and even consumption rights.
This institutionalization of pervasive systemic optimization would functionally complete the extension of the centralized 1950s planning logic into the digital age.
And it would lock the citizen into a highly efficient but micromanaged existence where individual freedom becomes completely subordinate to the optimization of the plan.
This has been a structurally cold, but I have to say a highly insightful look at these archival documents. The core finding is that the past isn't just history on a shelf. It's the active operational instruction manual for the present system you navigate every single day.
And as you reflect on this deep dive, I want you to keep the imagery from the 1950s firmly in your mind, particularly that New Year's Eve celebration in the Grand Kremlin Palace in 1954.
Right.
A massive, expensive state spectacle intended to signal abundance and security right alongside images of heavy machinery and destroyed cities being rebuilt. It was validation through visible size.
So a final thought for our listener.
Today, in 2026, when you encounter media coverage about a massive, expensive, state-sponsored spectacle or a technological first, whether that spectacle is digital, like a national AI platform rollout, or physical, like a colossal new piece of infrastructure, ask yourself this one question.
Okay.
Is this spectacle a genuine, granular metric of prosperity and improved local quality of life for you? Or is it simply the persistent, deeply ingrained echo of the mid-century structural decision to validate scale and centralized effort as the ultimate necessary evidence of collective success? The core structure of validation remains unchanged.
Look for the 0 kilometer in every system you interact with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.